Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So yes, as you can see from the title, I just watched Morbius. Let's talk about it. So Morbius is directed by Daniel Espinosa, and this is the latest release from Sony that is a part of their spin-off branch of the Spider-Verse. Yeah, Sony is doing this thing where it has these Spider-Verse characters be introduced in their independent films, and we'll talk about my thoughts on that a bit later, but this is yet another entry into that realm that they're setting up for themselves. And by the way, this is the corner of Marvel that has absolutely nothing to do with the MCU proper. Do not get it confused with the MCU proper, okay? Because despite the fact that the marketing for this film had Marvel written all over it, this in fact does not have anything to do with Kevin Feige's Marvel, aka the MCU proper. So let's just get that out of the way. And before we delve into my thoughts on the film itself, just a couple of disclaimers and a couple of, I guess, housekeeping points. First of all, I'm still recovering. I'm still recovering from last week. And no, I'm not talking about the Oscars. I'm talking about the flu. Guys, I was knocked off my ass by the flu last week. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't pretty. Let me tell you, I was so sick. I was so sick. And I even had like a third Oscars video that I was supposed to post for you guys, talking about the Oscars in general and the trajectory of the ceremony, etc, etc. But I didn't even get a chance to do so because I was literally knocked off my ass by the flu. So that's number one. I'm still reeling from last week, being sick as a dog. Sick as a dog, okay, at death's door. And also because I'm still kind of get over that sickness, first of all, it took me longer to see Morbius to begin with. Not that I was gonna go out rushing, rushing to see this film, but also it means that we're getting like straight shooter gene. Like, I'm not here to dance around. I'm not doing that, do you know, like today, no, I'm tired. I'm tired, I can barely think straight. And lastly, before we get into the film, I did just want to mention that, guys, you can go ahead and follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is It's So Jean. I'm not the biggest social media person, like I'm not the biggest social media girly, okay? I pretty much just do YouTube, but I was thinking, because I was so out last week and because I was literally at death's door last week, I was like, man, if only people knew where I was, because I did mention that I was going to be posting that Oscars video and I felt like I'd let you guys down. So if you guys follow me on Twitter, I can give you guys updates into, you know, what's going on with the channel, and also I can give you guys my mini reviews of what I've been watching, because there are a ton of shows and movies that I watch in my free time that I don't always get a chance to review here. So I thought it'd be fun if I went ahead and shared some of my thoughts on Twitter for those of you who are following me. So yeah, follow me on Twitter, It's So Jean. You know, it'll be fun time and you'll get updates, and perhaps you'll be able to like anticipate when I post, because I know that sometimes it's like, oh, she's posted without any forewarning. I'm going to try and get better at communicating with you guys, and if you follow me on Twitter, that will really help out. But with all of that being said, let me conserve my energy so we can roast this film. Let's get into my thoughts on Morbius. So first of all, I know I just told the joke about roasting Morbius, but I did just want to address the excessive, okay, the exaggerative negative reviews that I have seen for this film, because going into the film, I had seen the headlines about the Rotten Tomatoes score being like 16%, 17%, and it's around about there now anyways. But then when the film actually came out, the audience score was around about like 60-70%. There was such a disconnect between what critics were saying and what audiences were experiencing that it kind of made me raise my eyebrow. And again, because I had to wait a couple of days before seeing this because I was ill, I really did look to the audience score to see a better picture of what people thought about this film. That's not to say that the critics were completely irrelevant, but I did feel like critics were really jumping on this film before it even came out. Like, let's face it, Morbius really had a negative rep, like it really had a huge hill to climb before it even was released in cinemas. And I think that critics knew that, and I think that they basically knew that they could get clicks by posting excessively negative reviews about the film, and so that's exactly what they did. So yeah, I did just want to start with that first of all, because it is an important point. It's something that I have been noticing when it comes to written reviews, where it's like, is it really that deep? Is it really that deep for you to be saying this film is like half a star out of 5 or whatever? Having said that though, now that I have seen the film for myself, whilst I don't think it's the worst film in the world as some reviewers have portrayed it to be, it's not good. It's not good. I don't know what to say, guys. It's not good. There are problems, there are issues, but I do think that, you know, 16% is an exaggeration. Also, keep in mind that the Rotten Tomatoes score is just an aggregate of all of the reviewers. Basically, the reviewers get asked, like, would you recommend this, yes or no? And the Rotten Tomatoes score is the percentage of people who voted yes or no. So in this case, 17% said yes, and the 83%, quick maths, the 83% said no. So that's all that means. But if you actually click on the individual reviews, you'll see the actual scores that each of the reviewers give the film. Okay, so let's talk about the first issue when it comes to Morbius, because there are a ton, and I have a whole list that we need to get through. So we just need to be upfront and, like I said, very blunt about this. I can barely breathe through my nose. I don't have time to be wishy-washy, okay? So first of all, the story sucks. The story out the window. The story sucks. The story is awful. And in this case, I rarely call out the writers and directors, but writers, directors, come up front, sit down. Okay, we need to have a chat. What the hell is this? What the hell is this? First of all, this story follows the same pattern that I've been noticing from a lot of Sony films recently, and that is that these films feel like they were made 20 years ago. Why? Why do these films feel so dated, so antiquated? Like, we've moved so far past the films of the early noughties at this point. How is Sony still pumping out this old news type formula, hoping that we won't notice that this is the kind of film that they would have released in the 90s or in the early 2000s? I noticed. I noticed, okay? This film feels so old-fashioned and dated, and it follows on after Venom and Venom 2 and Uncharted in this trend. But even though Venom and Uncharted did suffer those same issues of feeling really dated, the advantages that they had is that they had charismatic leads that people really latched onto. And in the case of Venom, that whole franchise is basically held up on Tom Hardy's very capable shoulders. Like, let's face it, okay, the reason why we tune in to watch a Venom film isn't because of the plot. No, don't be silly. It's because of Tom Hardy's relationship with this sentient goo. That's what it is, okay? We love his banter with the sentient goo, and so we tune in even though we know that the rest of the film is a mess. But in the case of Morbius, what reason do we have to tune in? Michael Morbius is not a compelling protagonist. He's really not. He's bare minimum behavior. He is, you know, the kind of protagonist that you would have gotten, again, 20 years ago, when just having a name actor, a known actor as the lead was enough to, you know, hold up an entire franchise. Well, guess what? We've moved on since then. It's no longer enough. Michael Morbius needed to give us something, and the man gave us nothing at all. That is issue number one. He doesn't have any discernible characteristics. He doesn't have any likable personality that you can really latch onto. There are moments where he is likable, but that's not the same as having a charismatic lead. That's not the same as having a character that people are going to go out of their way to dress up as or list as one of the most, you know, iconic comic book movie characters ever. If you think about the roster that we have here in the comic book movie world, like Steve Rogers, Tony Stark, T'Challa, even, you know, Venom, even Tom Hardy's Venom / Eddie Brock. Like, Morbius does not come anywhere near those characters. He simply does not. He pales in comparison, and not just because of his vampiric qualities. And speaking of which, another issue that I have with the Morbius film is that it doesn't really lean into the vampirism quite enough. Now listen, I'm a vampire girly. Yes, I am. I'm a vampire girly till I die, okay? I was one of those girls where in the late noughties, all of a sudden my bookshelves turned from colourful pinks, oranges, purples to black. literally just all black books, all vampire books in the wake of the Twilight era. I was one of those girlies. So I'm expecting a compelling vampire story, because guess what? I've read and seen them all. My standards are high. Here I only got some references to some vampiric lore, like the fact that he can go into the sun, unlike traditional vampires. In reality, his main connection to vampirism is just blood, like it's bloodlust, his thirst for blood. And that's just not enough for me. I really wanted them to dive into vampiric lore, to really set this character apart. I mean, speaking of having a charismatic lead that's unique in this really overcrowded space, what if they had really delved into the vampire experience and made him stand out in that way? I think that would have been a really unique quality for Morbius to have. And yes, we have Blade coming down the line, but Morbius actually came first. Like, Morbius was actually first to the scene. He had the chance to carve out his own niche of being the vampire girly, but he failed to do so because he has no discerning qualities about him. He has no sparkling characteristics about him to really make him stand out in the crowd. So yeah, I think the fact that he is a vampire is kind of wasted in the film. He could be any old monster who has a thirst for blood. I wanted them to really dive in deep into the vampire lore, and perhaps it's not something that's visible in the comics, you know, perhaps it's not something that is a mainstay with his character in the literature, but guess what? I don't care. Guess what? I don't care. Oh, when was the last time you read a Morbius comic? When was the last time? Oh, what? Never? When was the last time you read a Morbius please, no one's crying over the Morbius comics, okay? Or those of you who are, you would much rather have a decent film, right? Tell me you wouldn't much rather have a decent film. Now, the third problem with the story, am I on the third problem? Or is it like the 10th? I literally have no idea. I think it's the third problem. Whatever. The next problem with the story is how this film is structured, the screenplay itself, okay? And I mentioned earlier, I rarely call out, you know, the writers and the director, because guess what? I'm not qualified to do so. Like, I'm actually not I've never made a film. I'm not qualified to do so, okay? But in this case, guys, like, what actually happened? Guys, guys, did you watch this film in its entirety? Because it makes no goddamn sense. So in the case of the format, in the case of the layout, the structure, that's what I'm looking for. Sorry guys, I'm still sick, remember? The structure of this film, we start off in the future when Morbius is already an adult and he has already done his research to find the special bats that he needs to carry out this special experiment. So he's in Costa Rica and we see him coming out of a helicopter ready to go into this cave to trap some bats. And then you get this like flashback. It goes, you know, 25 years earlier to his time in Greece when he was staying at this hospital slash like boarding school, I believe it may have been. Basically a place to stay and to be educated whilst under Jared Harris's care. Okay, Jared Harris's care, and he meets his new friend there as well. But essentially, you know, he had a really difficult life because he suffers from this terminal illness that has been with him his entire life pretty much, and that has created a lot of serious mobility issues for him, and it has made it really difficult for him to live his life, you know, in a regular way, whilst also knowing that one day, very soon perhaps, he may end up dying. And so he dedicates his entire life to finding a cure for this illness that he and his friend has, and so that's why we see him in this, you know, mission in Costa Rica to try and find these special bats, right? So that backstory makes sense. But then the next scenes that we get are just so fast paced and they don't allow us to really sit with this story. They don't allow us to pause with this character, really understand him and really get to know him before we see the sequence of events that play out in this particular story. Now, obviously they have a lot on their hands trying to establish this character's origin story, especially because he's a character that not a lot of people in mainstream audiences have heard of, so they have to kind of introduce him in this laborious, again, very old-fashioned way. But it's just perplexing because that introduction is just so fast-paced. These scenes are just, you know, done in quick succession where you get snippets of his life, and also it feels like the scenes that are shown to us aren't the most important ones. It's very confusing the way that this is done, because say for example the scene in Costa Rica that the film starts off with, because it then goes on to a flashback, I fully expected that in a later scene we would go back to Costa Rica and see him trying out his experiments there, perhaps, you know, trying to see if this bat technology or bat DNA will work. But then we actually never go back to Costa Rica at all. We end up going to his like lab where a lot of this film takes place, which I think is a huge mistake, but I guess this film was made on the cheap, so fine. But it's just a weird structure to have then. And then for example, when you go back in time, when he's in Greece or Cyprus or somewhere and he's growing up with Milo, but they don't actually show us a development of the friendship between Michael and Milo. They just show us Michael basically imposing the name Milo on the guy, and he's kind of like an abrasive character at the beginning, but then you're expected to believe 5 minutes later that Milo is really upset that Michael has to move away so that he can study and become an expert in genetics and hopefully find a cure for this disease that they both have, when we really haven't seen that friendship flourish. There was no time to do so. And there is this scene later on that takes place in like Greece or Cyprus where Milo is on his own and he ends up on the streets, you know, listening to some school kids from across the road talk about him, and then he ends up getting beaten up on the street, and it's Jared Harris's character that saves him. But I couldn't help but think, why not set up their friendship that way, where, you know, he ends up getting beaten up, but perhaps Michael comes in and saves him instead, to really show how that friendship is formed. It's kind of like a classic Steve and Bucky situation where, you know, Bucky was protecting Steve from being bullied and harassed all the time, although he would start those fights. Like, why wouldn't you set up the story that way instead of introducing Michael as a bully and someone who was like really unlikable, and then they became friends, I guess, off screen, and then Milo was really upset when Michael had to go off. Like, that didn't really resonate. And because this friendship is really the most important relationship in this entire script, don't be fooled by, please, the female love interest. Don't be fooled. This friendship is the most important relationship in the film. I do think that the setup of this friendship in this flashback is actually really important, and they kind of fumble the bag. But what's really weird about the structure of this film is that not only does it feel really rushed, and it feels like the origin story is established in these like quick successive scenes that aren't really allowed to resonate with the audience. There's not enough of a pause to really allow the audience to kind of think about these scenes and really understand the character of Michael Morbius at the beginning there, to become invested in his story later on. Not only is that an issue, which is already a huge issue in an origin story, but then we get to a point, I guess the point where he becomes a vampire. We get to a point where the story just kind of flatlines. You know, pun intended. The story flatlines where it doesn't really know what else to do, because it's rushed all of the setup, it's rushed the origin story part. So now we get into today's events where he's become a vampire and he's going around killing these mercenaries, which is fine because they're mercenaries, who cares? Right? But he's killed a bunch of mercenaries, and then the serum gets into the wrong hands, i.e. Milo's hands, who's portrayed by Matt Smith. We'll talk about the characters in a second. And then they're just kind of like playing chase across the city. And like what do they actually do? Like, someone tell me, what do they actually do other than preventing each other from killing a bunch of people? What's the goal? Like, what's the 3-act structure? I'm telling you, the origin story is at the beginning, and they rush through the origin story. Nothing really sets in. And then you get to the point where he becomes a vampire. He discovers his powers. Okay, cool. And then what happens? Because you just get these compulsory action sequences that have no emotional resonance whatsoever, because they don't make sense in terms of the story, and also we don't really care about these characters enough because, like I said, the setup was fumbled. Okay, so speaking of the characters themselves, let's get into it, shall we? First of all, we have Jared Leto portraying Michael Morbius. So Jared Leto is, you know, still getting roles for some reason. For some reason, like, we're still hiring Jared Leto apparently. Okay, Hollywood, fine, whatever. Even though Jared Leto gets a lot of slack, and rightfully so, for various reasons, I do think he's capable of more than this. Still, you're like, this might be controversial, but I do think he's actually capable more than this. I do think it's his directing and the writing that has really just let him down in some ways, because this character has like nothing. And there are moments where he's cute. Like, there are moments where you're like, oh, he has a little bit of a personality. When he's talking to that little girl who's really sick, she has the same blood disease as him. And, you know, he's talking to her. You see the determination in his eyes. It's like, I need to find a cure to help people like you and me. That's something that you can really get behind, and you can really sympathize with the character in those moments. But they're few and far between. They're few far between, guys. I had nothing to sink my fangs into, as it were. So yeah, Michael Morbius as a character, he ain't going on the roster of most iconic comic book movie characters anytime soon. I'll just say that much. Also, on the topic of Michael Morbius, this is kind of a sticky subject that I'd be really interested to hear your guys' thoughts on, especially if you're a part of this community. But I wonder how you guys feel about this constant motif that we're seeing in comic book movies, because they come from the comics themselves, of people with disabilities or ailments or illnesses constantly seeking out a cure and having this like magical cure that makes them super strong, able-bodied, and with like heightened senses. Like, I wonder how some people perceive that trope, because, you know, hopefully it can be empowering, and hopefully people feel like determined by that and like positive about that, as opposed to feeling a bit dejected. But yeah, I just wonder what the psychological damage, or I guess impact, would be of constantly having that kind of trope in this genre, where you have someone who does have a disability or an illness and their whole life's purpose is to try and fix it. I think we may be moving away from that kind of mindset to a mindset of, you know, this person does have disabilities, but it doesn't define their entire life, and it's also not necessarily something that they have to fix about themselves. I will say, in the case of Michael Morbius, he has a terminal illness, so it makes sense that he would want to find a cure for that. But in the case of like characters like Steve Rogers, for instance, who was just like a smaller, weaker man who had, you know, illnesses, but nothing that was too terminal. Like, I wonder how people feel about this trope just in general. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Okay, so next one up we have is Milo, and he is portrayed by Matt Smith. I'm a huge fan of Matt Smith, and I'm so upset that he's in this film. I'm so upset he's in this film. He deserves better. Why isn't he in the MCU? Like, why isn't he in like a good MCU film? Why can't he be in like Blade? Like, oh, this is so annoying, because now he's not going to be available for any other MCU film. Although I guess maybe they could just pretend this never happened and he can go to the MCU anyways, because I think he's awesome. And yeah, he was having a fun time with this role. Like, he was playing the cackling villain. But the main problem with this character is that he has no real motives. Like, what does he actually want? He's a terrible villain. Because first of all, what he wanted was for Michael Morbius to find a cure for the disease that they both have. And then when he finds a cure, you know, Michael tries to tell him this isn't a cure worth taking because it will literally turn you into a murderous monster. Except he doesn't explain that, which really frustrated me. He doesn't explain why it is that Milo should stay away from this cure, and why Milo wouldn't want to take this after having led a life of pain and suffering. So of course Milo goes ahead and takes it anyways. So that was really frustrating. But yeah, at first it seemed like he did have a clear vision, and that was to use all of his resources to fund Michael's research by any means necessary. And then as soon as he takes a serum, like, the motives and the logic of the character just fly out of the window, because what does he want at that point? He kills this nurse, and he has a thirst for human blood at that point, and I guess he wants Michael to join him in this bloodthirstiness, so he tries to like pummel Michael until he agrees to do so. Like, I don't understand the plan here. What is the plan? Like, he literally is beating up Michael across the streets of New York just so that Michael can be like, okay, fine, we're vampires, I'm gonna go ahead and kill with you. Like, I don't know, like, What? It's really bizarre how this story's villain doesn't really have any motives, like, or any plan of his own. And this story is basically just about Michael having made a terrible mistake, turning himself into a vampire. Then his friend takes the same serum and turns himself into a vampire as well. And then they're just fighting because they have to, because it's a comic book movie. But in reality, if they just sat down, sat down over some coffee, okay, or over some mugs that secretly have blood in them, then they could have just talked this out, or they could have just gone their separate ways. Like, it's really not that deep. Also, speaking of the blood, so Michael Morbius created this artificial blood. That's the thing that he is known for, and apparently it has been really beneficial in the world of medicine, helping tons and tons of people around the world. So great for him. We see him receive a Nobel Prize for his work. Again, that's yet another scene that's just kind of flashed forward really quickly, that doesn't really have time to resonate with us, but he received a Nobel Prize and he cussed out the King of Sweden or something. Again, we didn't see that. We didn't see that, so we'll have to assume that's what happened, even though it could have been an interesting moment to get an insight into Michael's personality. No, we fast forwarded past that. Okay, we just get a reference to it in a newspaper. But he developed this artificial blood, and that's what he sustains himself from, after realizing that he only has a short time period before he goes full bat crazy. But then on the flip side, we have Milo, who's decided, F it, I'm just gonna go around drinking people's blood. Like, I'm not even gonna bother with the artificial blood. To which I say there is a middle ground. Okay, again, I am a vampire girly. I know my stuff. I've watched a ton of this stuff. So if you guys have watched the Vampire Diaries, you know I'm about to say, why don't they just go to a blood bank? But lastly, when it comes to these two, as I mentioned before, I do think that this is the relationship that is at the core of this story. And I think that was a really interesting angle. I think that if it had been carried out well, it would have been a unique factor to add into this landscape of comic book movies, where instead of having, you know, a love story, a romance be at the center of a comic book movie, you have a friendship, you know, the tale of two friends who just went their separate ways. And it's not the only story that we've seen like this, but I think Jared Leto and Matt Smith's chemistry on screen was really effective, and it really did stand out. So I do think it was enough to really carry that sort of storyline if they had really committed to that. But of course they had to muddy the waters. Of course they had to muddy the waters by introducing who? A love interest. Yes, we bring in the female love interest in the form of Martine Bancroft, who's portrayed by Adria Arjona. I have nothing against, you know, this actress. I think she did the best with what she was given with, and what she was given with is the bare minimum. The bare minimum. This is yet another sign that this script belongs in 2002 and not 2022, because the female character here sucks. And I need Sony to understand. I need Sony to understand that being a smart woman is not a personality trait. It's not a personality trait. Not enough for you to have a three-dimensional female character. Just being smart is not enough. There are a lot of smart women. There are. Believe it or not, there are. We're in abundance. So this trope of like, oh, the smart woman, you know, she's too cool for school, she's the smartest person in the room, blah, 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 blah. It's like, it's old now. It doesn't really do female characters justice, because in reality, you're just reducing them to being what? Hot, smart, and complacent. That's basically what they are in these stories, and that doesn't really push the needle for anyone in terms of female representation. It doesn't give us any iconic characters that we can really latch onto, like Natasha Romanoff or like Princess Shuri. Again, two very smart female characters, but have personality on top of that to really make them feel three-dimensional and for audiences to really latch onto them emotionally. Here, the female character is given about as much emotion as a doorknob. As a doorknob. This woman is only there to be the damsel in distress in the third act. That's literally her whole purpose, and you can tell from the way that she's written. Also, to add insult to injury, she had no chemistry with Jared Leto. None whatsoever. No romantic chemistry. No sparks were flying. I'm telling you, when it comes to the love storyline in particular, it felt like I had blinked and all of a sudden when my eyes were open again, they were kissing on screen and I was like, what? I wish they had just left it as her and him being friends, because they literally had no romantic chemistry, like -0. Are you kidding me? 2 weeks. Has it been 2 weeks or a week and a half since I watched Bridgerton season 2? Where I saw real romantic chemistry, where I saw the best love story ever told, and you want to present me with this? Really? How embarrassing. Next up, we have Jared Harris's character, who's barely a footnote in the story. Like, how embarrassing. They actually managed to waste Jared Harris. How embarrassing. How embarrassing for them. They wasted him. They didn't establish a relationship between, you know, his character and Milo, as well as his character and Michael. And so when he ends up being killed by Milo, you feel nothing at all. I literally heard crickets during that scene. Crickets in the cinema. Can you imagine? And then we move on to the 2 FBI agents. Guys, like, even the FBI agents were done dirty here. How do you fumble the bag with FBI agents? That is a character as old as time. That's a character as old as the American Constitution. How do you fumble the bag with an FBI agent character? So you have Tyrese, who's portraying this like hardened, really serious FBI agent. He's way too serious for this film and way too serious for that role. Like, I don't know why the director, I don't know why the director didn't step in and say, whoa, like, ease up just a little bit, because we're not getting anything from this character. There's a moment where he's literally like, oh, Michael's killing cops in my city. Like, he literally says that, in my city. Who are you? This isn't a Fast and Furious film. You'll see. Who are you? It was so bizarre. It was so weird. But then on the flip side of things, you have his partner, who's portrayed by Al Madrigal, and you know, he seems sweet, he seems cute, but I just didn't buy him as an FBI agent. He had the opposite issue, where he felt like a soft, squidgy teddy bear. And I know they were trying to go good cop, bad cop, but we never really got that interaction with Michael, where it felt like, okay, he was being manipulated by both of these FBI agents who are portraying these different styles of cop, as it were. So it wasn't even worth having those 2 characterizations. There should have just been one FBI agent, and it should have been someone with actual like charisma or like a unique quality to them, like a Jim Gordon or a Nick Fury. Like, oh my, these guys were nowhere near. So then I wanted to just touch on some more general points before we finish off with, well, how this film ended, okay? What really made me mad. So first of all, the city, I believe this is set in New York, or is it Boston? Or I don't know where it's and this is a problem. This is yet another problem with this film, is that the place itself has no personality. I mean, at least in Venom, you have the iconic hills of San Francisco, which really sets it apart as a franchise. In the case of Morbius, I have no idea. I guess they're in New York, like I presume, but the city doesn't have a footprint in the script itself. It doesn't have a personality. And also, speaking of the city having a personality, there's a sequence that takes place in the underground, and I'm pretty sure I haven't checked this yet, maybe it is the case, I'll check and then I'll let you guys know through editing, but I'm pretty sure the scene that takes place in the train station is in like a London train station. Am I insane? I'm quite the, you know, London Underground enthusiast myself, so I feel like I recognize a London Underground train station when I see one. It felt like parts of that scene were definitely filmed in London, like in a London Underground train station, because that did not look like the New York subway to me, that I know of. Again, never been to New York though, so I may be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure they just masked up a London Underground station and made it look like the New York subway in certain moments, because that does not, something was okay, so guys, I said that I was gonna check whilst I was editing, but I couldn't wait. I was right. I was absolutely right. It's a London Underground station. Not only is it a London Underground station, but they filmed this film in Manchester. No wonder it's no discernible qualities to it. It's not even in America. It's not even in Canada. It's in Manchester. And I know Manchester because I lived there for a few years during uni. So I feel like that's the reason why I felt like I knew this place, but it didn't feel like New York. Like that's the reason why, okay? But anyway, my point is that they didn't use the setting to their advantage, and it felt like it was just set in a city. The place itself didn't have any personality to allow this film to stand out again from the ocean of comic book movies that we have. And the second issue with this film was the CG. Now, I actually don't think that the CG was the end of the world. I think they did a pretty good job with the echolocation. It was a pretty cool effect, although I'm pretty sure I've seen it in another film before. Can't remember what film it is. Batman Begins, just remembered. It was in Batman Begins. Yeah, it was in Batman Begins with the echolocation. That makes sense. That would have killed me if I hadn't remembered, but I did. Yeah, so I've seen that effect done before, but you know, it was pretty good. Like, it was pretty and also the CG, you know, creating the actual faces, especially because the vampires shift in and out of their vampire face. I thought that was pretty good as well. And I do think that Morbius overall has a pretty cool look. Again, a look that really makes him stand out from the rest of these comic book movie characters. I will say though, in the scenes where he's fighting, it's just not impressive. Like, it's just nothing to write home about. Again, it doesn't help that the fight sequences have no real meaning because the villain's plan is just non-existent and his motives are non-existent. But you know, when the fighting does take place, it's not even, you don't feel anything, not only because of the story and how it's written, but also because of the visuals. It just feels like two blobs just kind of attacking each other for no apparent reason. So I would say that the realization of those action sequences wasn't the best. And I also would say, again, they should have really tapped into the, you know, vampiric lore. Like, I know that it might be cheesy to some, but it's better than what we got here, where they could have been any old monsters, any old aliens. They didn't necessarily have to be vampires. And aside from the echolocation and the bloodlust, like, there really was no tie to that lore. And it's a really rich literature and lore that you can dive into that they missed the opportunity to do so in this film. And finally, we need to talk about the end credit sequence. I'm not even going to say much other than that was dumb as hell. Dumb as hell. Oh my god, guys, that was dumb as hell. So in the end credit sequence, we have Adrian Toomes, you know, climbing out from the MCU verse into the Morbius verse, and they're making a Sinister Six together. They're Sinister Sixing. They're Sinister Sixing, and I'm supposed to, like, what, gasp? Like, in shock and in happiness and excitement? No, I had this look on my face, like, guys, I can't believe Sony is making the same mistakes again. Why would you introduce Adrian Toomes into a Morbius film? And I know that he appeared in the early trailers of Morbius, so we knew that he may have something to do with the film, but the fact that they added it in as an end credit scene to be like, oh, now he's in this universe, wonder what these two are gonna get up to. It's like, this literally makes no sense. Why wouldn't you introduce Morbius into a Venom film instead, to incorporate him with the Venom franchise, instead of having Adrian Toomes come along? I mean, Michael Keaton is good, but he's not that good. He can't make this make sense, okay? And also, why would Morbius form a Sinister Six with Adrian Toomes to begin with? What does Morbius have in common with the Vulture? Like what is the connective tissue there? There is none. So this is going to fall apart. This is going to fall apart. There's no connective tissue. It makes no sense. I thought Morbius was the good guy. Why is he working with the bad guy now? So guys, overall, I mean, Morbius isn't the worst film in the world, okay? The reviewers saying that it is are just kind of exaggerating a little bit, or maybe they are so sensitive to mediocre films that they think that anything that is below a 3 out of 5 is just horrific and terrible. terrible and life-threatening. And this is for sure lower than a 3 out of 5, but I wouldn't say it's like a 0 out of 5. It's a film that's watchable, but I wouldn't recommend you rush out to see it in the cinema. Please don't waste your money. I mean, in this landscape we have a new comic book movie slash TV show coming out literally every week. Literally every week. I wouldn't waste my time with a Morbius. And so with all of that being said, I'm going to be giving Morbius a 4 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on Morbius, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this film if you did watch it. If you did watch it, down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. And like I said, follow me on Twitter so you can get some updates on what's going on behind the scenes. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.